The Lone Wolf's Mate, a steamy fated werewolf romance. Welcome, dear listener, to another Fated Mates, Werewolf Romance Audiobook woven romance, drama, intimacy, and steamy paranormal romance, a story that promises to intrigue and captivate. Shall we begin? Act 1. The Outcast Wolf. Lucas Wolf took the night shift like it was his birthright. His boots cut a lonely path through the dirt roads of that tucked-away mountain town. The moon hung overhead, pale as a spent coin, casting long shadows across broken fences and shuttered storefronts. Each step felt both routine and loaded, like he was carrying more than his frame ought to. He kept to the edges of the dim street lamps, half watching the windows of folks who knew to stay locked in after sundown. His senses were sharp eyes scanning every doorway, ears picking up rustling in the distant pines. As part of the pack, he was bound by a code that said he had to protect these people from what prowled in the dark. But the pack itself, that was another matter. Lucas was no model son, and his alpha never let him forget it. He was too restless for their taste, too haunted by a past he wouldn't talk about. Yet here he was, circling the perimeter like a loyal dog on a leash, or a wolf on a mission. A cloud drifted across the moon, and his mind went to the night it all went sideways. Blood on the pines, howls that shook the timber, and the guilt that settled on him afterward. He couldn't shake it even now. The pack needed him, but he felt like a man on thin ice, waiting for the crack. He paused by an old sign that read leaving Crescent Bluffs, the words chipped and faded. His eyes moved to the tree line beyond. Something stirred in the brush. Maybe a stray fox. Maybe worse. Lucas tensed, one hand at his side, where his nails threatened to sharpen. The urge to shift was always there, just under the surface, coiled and ready. He exhaled, forced himself to keep moving. Tomorrow he'd circle these roads again, always on the outside looking in. Part of a family he could never fully claim. It was the curse of the lone wolf, and fate had branded it across his soul. Lucas slipped into the pack's makeshift den, a rundown cabin hidden behind a ring of pines. The place smelled of old timber and damp earth. It suited them, a ragtag group trying to pretend they belonged when half the world insisted they didn't. The alpha, a tall figure with squared shoulders, stood near the dying embers of a fire. His gaze pinned Lucas like a wolf stalking fresh prey. Lucas cleared his throat and spoke low, giving the night's report. No strangers in town yet, no trouble at the borders. Safe enough, for now. Keep it that way, the alpha said. His voice was gravelly, the kind that forced a man to listen. We've heard rumors, something about folks snooping for evidence of us. He didn't elaborate. He never did. Lucas knew better than to push. I'll keep my head down, Lucas said. A half-truth. His entire life was spent walking that thin line, loyal to the pack, but never truly in it. The alpha stepped closer. We can't afford outsiders asking the wrong questions. Watch yourself. Lucas nodded. He left the alpha standing there, eyes on the embers like he was reading secrets in the glow. Outside, the night air felt crisper. A breeze rolled in over the treetops, carrying a hint of something new. His spine went rigid. That scent, it wasn't local, and it wasn't wolf. Human, maybe a woman, and different from the run-of-the-mill travelers who passed through once in a while. He lifted his head, sniffed again. It danced on the wind, stirring a mix of curiosity and caution. If someone had come to poke around, they'd soon see more than they bargained for. Lucas scanned the woods, half expecting to spot a shape behind the branches. Nothing moved, but he knew he wasn't alone. A cold prickle crawled up his neck, like eyes were drilling into him from the dark. He stood still, alert, waiting for a glimpse of whoever was out there. Then he heard the snap of a twig far off in the trees. He whipped his gaze to the spot, heart hammering against his ribcage. No one showed, but he could sense it, a watcher, hidden in the gloom. He set off toward town, mind spinning on that scent, aware that everything might change once he found its source. The bus rolled to a stop with a hiss of brakes, kicking dust into the stale mountain air. Maya Lin stepped down, adjusting the strap of her bag while her gaze swept the town. Crescent Bluffs. It looked like it had been forgotten somewhere in time. Wooden storefronts, a lone gas station, a diner that probably hadn't changed its menu since the 50s. The kind of place where people knew each other's business before breakfast. She pulled her jacket tighter, more from instinct than cold. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth, but underneath it something else. A feeling, like the town itself was waiting, watching. The driver tossed her suitcase onto the curb. Last stop. You sure you got the right place? Maya forced a polite smile. Looks right to me. He grunted, climbed back onto the bus, and pulled away, leaving her alone with the hum of a flickering streetlight and the distant sound of crickets. She took out her phone and checked her notes. Disappearances. Unexplained animal attacks. Sightings. The stories had started decades ago, whispers that most dismissed as backwoods superstition. But something about the reports gnawed at her. Too many cases had the same details, too many loose ends. She'd followed stranger leads before, but this one had weight. A week ago, an old contact had tipped her off. Crescent Bluffs isn't just another ghost story. You want something real? Go there. Just don't expect them to talk. Maya had never been good at leaving things alone. She pocketed her phone and picked up her bag, heading for the only motel in sight. The pavement felt uneven under her boots, like the town had been settling into itself for years. A couple of locals watched her from the porch of a general store, their eyes skimming over her with that practiced disinterest small-town folks gave outsiders. She offered a nod, got nothing in return. That was fine. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to dig up the truth. Maya had been in town less than an hour, and already she felt the walls closing in. The general store smelled of dust and old coffee. Shelves lined with canned goods, hunting gear, and the kind of hardware a man could use to mend a fence or bury a body. The man behind the counter, stocky with a weather-beaten face, eyed her the way a dog watches a stranger step too close to its food. She set a bottle of water and a pack of gum on the counter, pushing a 20 across the wood. Busy town? He grunted. Depends. On who's asking? She gave him a patient smile. Just a writer. Looking into some local legends. The register clunked open, and he counted out her change without looking up. What legends? Maya pulled out her notepad, flipped a few pages. I've read about a few strange reports. Sightings. People disappearing near the woods. She let the words sit. Ever hear anything like that? The air in the store thickened. The two men browsing the fishing gear stiffened, suddenly very interested in hooks and lures. The old man's hand hovered over the register, fingers tapping slow against the counter. Ain't much out there but trees and bad footing, he said. And the howls? The tapping stopped. Maya held his gaze, waiting. He exhaled through his nose, grabbed her change, and set it on the counter. You're new. Let me give you some advice. He leaned in, voice low and edged. Don't go digging in things that ain't yours to dig. She pocketed the cash, studying his face. The lines in it told a story, but he wasn't about to share it. Appreciate the warning, she said. He nodded toward the door. She took the hint. Maya walked the streets, noting the way people looked at her like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. A woman sweeping her porch paused mid-stroke, lips pressed tight. A couple of men near the gas station went quiet as she passed. It wasn't the usual small-town suspicion of an outsider. It was something deeper, older. She pulled out her phone and snapped a few photos of the storefronts, the road leading into the woods. Crescent Bluffs was the kind of town that looked the same in every decade. Quiet, ordinary. The kind of place that didn't make the news unless something ugly happened. And something ugly had. She just had to find out what. She turned a corner near the edge of town, eyes scanning the treeline. That was when she saw him. A man tall, built like a brawler, standing at the forest's edge like he belonged to it. Black Henley, worn jeans, boots that had seen miles of rough ground. Hair pulled back at the nape, the kind that held the last bit of sun from an afternoon long gone. Maya should have kept walking. Instead, she stopped. He wasn't looking at her, but something about him made her feel like he was. like he had been long before she ever stepped off that bus. Her fingers curled around her notepad, heart tapping a different kind of beat now. There was something about him, something that made her forget the way the townspeople had looked at her, something that made her wonder if she should be looking into the woods instead. She exhaled, set her shoulders. She was here to find the truth, and something told her he was part of it. Maya stepped off the dirt road and into the trees. The air was different here, thicker, laced with the scent of damp leaves and pine needles crushed underfoot. The sun had dropped low, burning the sky in deep oranges and purples, but the woods swallowed the light faster than the town. She had her phone out, snapping quiet shots of claw marks on a tree trunk, deep gouges that didn't belong to any bear she'd ever researched. A few feet away, an old fence lay half buried in the undergrowth, as if something had barreled through it. The rumors weren't just stories. Something moved in these woods. She crouched, running a hand over the fresh split in the wood, trying to guess what could leave a mark like that. Maybe it was just the wind, but the air felt charged now, like a storm was about to break. Then the voice came from the shadows. "You shouldn't be here." Maya shot up, heartbeat kicking against her ribs. The man from the edge of town stood just a few yards away, half hidden between the trees. He hadn't been there a second ago. At least she hadn't seen him. Lucas Wolf. She hadn't asked his name, but she'd heard it at the motel. The woman at the front desk had said it like it carried weight, like speaking it too loudly might call something down. "I didn't realize this was private land," she said, keeping her voice even. "It's not, but it's dangerous." His posture was loose, hands relaxed at his sides, but there was something about him that read like a coiled wire ready to snap if needed. Maya squared her shoulders, not stepping back. "I can handle myself." Lucas made a sound low in his throat, something like amusement but not quite. "That what you told the store clerk earlier? Before he warned you to keep out of things that aren't your business?" So he'd been listening. "Maybe I don't take advice from men who grunt instead of talk," she said. Lucas took a slow step forward, and she noticed two things at once. First, the way he moved silent, smooth, like a shadow with muscle. Second, the way his eyes caught the last bit of light. The color wasn't just green. It was sharp, too sharp, something that made her think of deep woods and untamed places. He tilted his head just enough to make it clear he was sizing her up. "People don't come here by accident," he said. "They come because they're looking for something." Maya felt it then. The hum beneath her skin, the same instinct that had made her follow this story to Crescent Bluffs in the first place. Only now it wasn't pointing toward the legends. It was pointing at him. He watched her, waiting. She exhaled, steadying herself. "Maybe I am looking for something." Lucas didn't blink. "Then you'd better hope you don't find it." The woods had gone still. Too still. Maya noticed it first in the silence, how the wind had stopped threading through the trees, how even the insects had cut their usual night chatter. Then came the howl, long drawn out, too close, not a coyote, not anything she'd ever heard before. Her body tensed, a cold shock running up her spine. She turned toward the sound, and before she could process the movement, Lucas was there. It wasn't a hesitation or a second guess. One moment he was standing a few feet away, unreadable. The next he was between her and the trees, broad back to her, weight balanced like a man ready for a fight. Maya barely breathed. "That was not your concern," Lucas cut in. His voice was lower now, tight with something she hadn't heard before. Something moved in the brush beyond them. Not fast, not loud, but enough for his shoulders to lock up, his stance shifting. "Get back to town," he said, voice calm but firm. Now, Maya wasn't in the habit of taking orders, but something in his tone made her want to listen. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something old, like he knew exactly what was out there. She should have backed away. She should have taken the out. But she didn't. Instead, she angled her head to look at him and saw his eyes. For a second, no more than a breath, they caught the last of the light. But it wasn't just green anymore. It was sharp, unnatural. Alive in a way that had nothing to do with being human. Then it was gone. Maya swallowed, pulse jumping. Lucas exhaled, long and slow, like he was fighting something down. "Go," he said again, but now it sounded like a warning. Like something dangerous was standing right in front of her. Maya didn't move. She didn't know if she could. She only knew one thing for sure. Whatever she was chasing in this town, whatever truth she thought she was after, it had just found her first. Lucas wasn't the kind of man who asked for favors. But then again, this wasn't exactly a favor. The Alpha's words had been clear. She's in too deep. Either make sure she finds nothing, or make sure she stops looking. Lucas had said nothing, but he'd felt the weight of it. He knew how the pack handled loose ends. He also knew Maya Lin wasn't the type to scare easy, which is why he found himself outside the town's only diner, watching her through the plate glass window. She sat in a back booth, one leg crossed over the other, a notebook open beside her coffee cup. Her pen tapped a slow rhythm against the table as she studied whatever she'd written. Lucas pulled the door open, and the scent of burnt coffee and grilled onions hit him. The few regulars scattered around the place turned their heads, took him in, and went back to their meals. He was used to it. People in town had a way of pretending he wasn't there, so long as he let them. Maya, though, she noticed. Her shoulders tensed the second she saw him walking toward her booth, a reaction she probably didn't even realize she was having. She set the pen down but didn't close the notebook. Didn't invite him to sit either. Lucas slid onto the bench across from her anyway. She exhaled through her nose, tapping the edge of her coffee cup. "So now you make house calls?" "I was in the neighborhood." "Lucky me." He leaned back against the booth, watching her. The overhead light caught in her hair, turning the black strands warm, like smoldering embers. Her eyes, sharp and steady, locked on his, waiting. "You're asking a lot of questions," he said. "Might be easier if you had someone who actually knew the answers." Maya tilted her head, like she was deciding how much of her time he was worth. "That's someone being you." "That's the deal," he said. "I tell you what's worth knowing. In return, you don't go digging where you shouldn't." A corner of her mouth lifted. "Not quite a smile, not quite anything else. And who decides where I shouldn't?" Lucas met her gaze. "Me." She sat back, considering. The diner hummed around them, plates clinking, the low rumble of conversation, the faint scrape of the cook's spatula against the grill. She drummed her fingers against the table once, twice. Then she exhaled, reaching for her coffee. "All right," she said. "You want to be my guide? Fine. But if you think this means I stop looking, you don't know me very well." Lucas watched her take a slow sip, her eyes still on him over the rim of the cup. He had a feeling he was about to. The old farmstead stood on the edge of nowhere, its bones half sunk into the earth like it had been waiting too long for someone to remember it. The roof had caved in on one side, and the windows were empty, dark holes staring out at the land. The air smelled of damp wood and something older, something that didn't belong to the town anymore. Maya adjusted the strap of her bag and stepped over a broken fence post. "This place has a story," she said, running a hand over the splintered wood. "Everything here does." Lucas walked a few paces behind, watching the tree line more than the ruins. His posture was loose, but his eyes were sharp. "You think every story deserves to be told?" "That's what I do." She glanced over her shoulder at him. "You don't." He let his gaze slide to the farmhouse. "Some stories get people killed." The way he said it made her pause. Not a warning. A fact. She turned back to the ruins, pretending not to notice the way the air had changed between them. She crouched near an old stone foundation, brushing dirt away from something metal, a rusted horseshoe half buried. "This used to belong to someone," she said. "A family, probably. A life." Lucas stayed where he was. "Not anymore." She looked up at him then. "What happened here?" He exhaled, slow. "Time." Maya wasn't buying it. There was more in his voice, something weighted. "You know, for a guide, you don't do much talking." "I talk when it matters." She stood, dusting her hands off. "You don't strike me as the open book type." Lucas's mouth curved, but it wasn't quite a smile. "You asking for personal history?" I figure if I'm trusting you to keep me from walking into trouble, I should know a few things. Lucas stepped closer, studying her like he was weighing something. I grew up here, he said finally. Didn't leave when I should have. That's all the history that matters. Maya crossed her arms, tilting her head. You don't believe that. He met her gaze, and for a second, the world shrank down to the space between them. She felt the weight of his presence, the steady pull of something she couldn't name. Lucas broke the moment first, turning toward the collapsed barn. You want to see something worth remembering? She hesitated, then followed. She wasn't sure what she was looking for anymore, but she had the feeling she was about to find it. The barn smelled of dust and old rot, the kind of place time had forgotten. The rafters sagged, half the roof was gone, and the floorboards groaned under every step. Maya walked ahead, taking in the scene, her fingers brushing over a rusted chain hanging from a post. This was a working farm once, she said. Before the floor gave out under her feet. She didn't have time to think, only feel wood splintering, gravity yanking her down. The dark mouth of the cellar rushed up to meet her. Then something caught her, hard, unyielding and fast. Lucas. 1 second she was falling. The next she was in his arms, chest heaving, adrenaline slicing through her veins. His grip was solid, one arm locked around her waist, the other bracing them both. The muscles in his arms were tense, his body pressed close, and for a moment all she could do was breathe. She looked up. His face was too close, sharp angles, steady gaze. Eyes holding something between irritation and something else she couldn't name. He set her back on the stable part of the floor, hands lingering just long enough to be sure she had her balance. Maya swallowed. Fast reflexes. Lucas didn't answer. She pulled in a breath and glanced at the cellar opening. The hole yawned wide, deep, lined with rotting beams and broken stone. It should have been a bad fall. It would have been. She turned back to him. You, his jaw tightened. Watch where you step. He turned away, but Maya didn't. Her pulse was still high, but not just from the near miss. Lucas Wolf had caught her like she weighed nothing. Like gravity didn't work the same for him. Like the world bent around his movements, not the other way around. She'd been chasing stories all her life, following rumors, piecing together half-truths. And for the first time, she wondered if she wasn't just following the wrong lead. Maybe she'd been following the wrong man. The lake stretched wide and still, holding the moon's reflection like a secret. Maya sat on a flat rock near the water's edge, arms wrapped around her bent knees, watching the sky. She heard him before she saw him, the quiet steps over dirt and stone, careful but certain. Lucas. You always come out here alone. His voice was low, edged with something that wasn't quite concern, but wasn't far from it either. She didn't look at him. I like the quiet. He stood there for a second, then settled down on the other end of the rock. Not too close, not far either. Maya glanced at him. You? I don't mind the quiet. She smirked, turning back to the sky. No, I mean, do you always come out here alone? Lucas was still for a moment. Then he said, yeah. She let that sit. There was something about the way he said it, the weight of it. It wasn't just a habit. It was a way of being. He was built for silence. She was built for questions. Ever hear the stories about this lake? She asked. Lucas exhaled, eyes on the water. Depends which ones. The usual. Ghosts. Lost lovers. She paused. Werewolves. That got him. He didn't move, but something shifted in his posture, the kind of stillness that meant he was listening hard. You think there's something to them? She asked, watching him now. His gaze stayed on the water. What do you think? Maya stretched her legs out, ankles crossing. I think people don't just make things up for no reason. Stories get passed down because there's a thread of truth in them. Sometimes it's twisted, sometimes it's stretched. But there's always something real at the center. Lucas turned his head, studying her. The air between them tightened, just enough to be noticed. What's at the center of this one? He asked. She tilted her head. You tell me. For a second, he didn't answer. Then he looked away, back at the lake. Some things aren't meant to be pulled apart. Doesn't mean they don't deserve to be understood. His jaw flexed, a muscle ticking there. Maya exhaled. "You know, for someone who's supposed to be helping me, you don't say much." Lucas smirked, but it was faint. Talking too much gets people in trouble, maybe. But saying nothing doesn't mean trouble disappears. Something passed between them then, a thread pulled too tight. Maya didn't know what made her say it. Maybe the night, maybe the way the lake felt like it held more than just reflections. "You ever feel like you're carrying something too heavy?" she asked. Lucas didn't move. Didn't speak right away. Then, finally a low, quiet answer. "Yeah," she turned toward him, waiting. He didn't say anything else. But he didn't have to. Lucas stared at the lake, its surface smooth and dark, like it had swallowed more than its share of secrets. Maya waited. She wasn't the kind of woman to fill silence just to kill it. She let it sit between them, let him decide what he wanted to do with it. After a while, he exhaled, long and steady. "I lost someone." Maya glanced at him. His face was hard, set in stone, but his hands had curled into fists. She didn't push. "Who?" Lucas shook his head, jaw tight. "Someone I should have protected." She let that sit. He hadn't said couldn't. He'd said shouldn't. Like it wasn't just loss, like it was failure. Maya pulled her knees up again, resting her chin on them. "You blame yourself." His breath hitched, just for a second. Then he looked at her. "What else is there?" Maya held his gaze. His eyes, green and sharp, were full of something old. Something she recognized. She turned back to the lake. "I know that feeling." Lucas shifted. "You lose someone." She shook her head. "Not like that. But I know what it's like to chase something, thinking it'll fix what's broken. Thinking if you just find the right answer, it'll all make sense." Lucas watched her now. "That why you came here?" Maya let out a breath, looking down at her hands. "I grew up in a city where people don't stop moving. My father was always working. My mother thought emotions made people weak. I spent my childhood trying to prove I was strong enough not to need anything. Then I got older and realized that meant I had nothing." Lucas was quiet. Maya kept her eyes on the water. "So I started looking for something bigger. A story that mattered. Something I could chase that would make all the other empty spaces not matter so much." Lucas turned back to the lake. "And you think this is it?" Maya gave a half smile. "I think I don't know yet." The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't heavy. Lucas let out a slow breath. "The person I lost," he said. "They trusted me, and I failed them." Maya didn't answer right away. Then she reached over, just for a second, and let her fingers brush his forearm. Just a touch, just enough. Lucas looked at her. Maya held his gaze. "You're still here." For the first time, he didn't have an answer. The night settled around them, thick and quiet. The lake barely moved, the sky stretching endless above, and for once, Maya wasn't thinking about her next question. Lucas sat close enough that she could feel the weight of him, the kind of presence that filled a space without trying. His arm rested on his knee, fingers loose, but there was tension in him. Coiled, like a string pulled too tight. She shifted just a little, just enough that her hand skimmed his. Not much, barely anything. But he went still. Maya felt the heat of his skin, the way his breath changed. Lucas didn't pull away. Her pulse kicked up, and she told herself it was nothing, that it was just the moment, the stillness, the quiet, the weight of whatever had just passed between them. But she knew better. She turned her head, met his gaze. His eyes held her there. Not just looking, but seeing, like he was searching for something he wasn't sure he'd find. The space between them shrank, air heavy charged. Maya's breath came slower now, her skin prickling like she was standing at the edge of something deep. Lucas wasn't touching her, not really, but it felt like he was. She could step back. She didn't. Lucas's fingers twitched, just the smallest movement, like he was about to close the gap. Then his jaw tightened, and he exhaled rough. He turned his head, looking back out at the water. Maya let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They sat there, neither speaking. The moments stretched thin between them. Then Lucas went rigid. His head lifted, shoulders squared. His body, easy and loose a second ago, was a live wire now. Maya barely had time to open her mouth before she heard it. A howl. Far enough that it wasn't close, but close enough that it wasn't far. Lucas stood, scanning the tree line. The warmth in his eyes was gone now, replaced with something sharp. Maya rose slowly, her body tensed. "That's not a coyote." Lucas didn't answer. The air changed, something raw moving through it, making her skin crawl. Lucas finally looked at her, his jaw set. "You should go." Maya wasn't sure if he meant back to town, back to the motel, or back to whatever life she'd had before she walked into this one. But she knew one thing for sure. Whatever was out there, whatever had just called into the night was coming. Maya sat in the back corner of the library, flipping through brittle pages of an old town ledger. The dust hung thick in the air, catching in her throat. The records weren't organized, at least not in a way that made sense. Half the documents had been handwritten, names crossed out and rewritten, dates smudged. Crescent Bluffs had a way of burying the past. She tapped her pen against the desk, eyes narrowing at a familiar phrase scrawled across the margins of an old report. Unexplained deaths near the forest edge. No suspects. Possible animal attack. That phrase had appeared half a dozen times in different records, different years. The details changed, but the ending stayed the same. The town shrugged, looked the other way, and nothing ever got solved. She kept reading. Then a name caught her eye. Lockwood. She flipped back a few pages. There it was again. Different year. Same name. Maya sat up straighter, the hairs on her arms rising. The Lockwood family had been in Crescent Bluffs for generations. Old money, big landowners kept to themselves, but carried weight in town. There were no official records tying them to the disappearances, but the pattern was too clean. Every 10, 15 years, another incident, and another Lockwood watching from the edges. Maya scribbled notes, her pulse quickening. She wasn't sure what it meant yet, but she knew one thing. The Lockwoods weren't just another rich family, and they weren't just watching. The air in the forest was thick, damp from the rain that had passed through that morning. The scent of wet pine clung to the ground. Maya moved carefully, her boots light against the earth. She hadn't meant to end up this deep in the woods, but her gut had pulled her forward, deeper past the usual paths, past the places hikers wandered through before turning back. Something was off. Then she saw them. 3 men stood near the edge of a clearing, half hidden by the trees. Their clothes were practical dark jeans, work boots, jackets too heavy for the weather. The kind of men who weren't here by accident. One of them knelt near a tree, examining something in the dirt. The others stood back, scanning the area, their posture too rigid to be casual. Maya ducked lower, pressing behind a thick trunk, heart hammering. Hunters. She didn't know how she knew, only that she did. Everything about them was wrong. She started to move back, slow and quiet. Then her foot caught on a root. A sharp snap cut through the silence. The men's heads whipped toward her. She ran. Branches tore at her arms as she sprinted back toward town, pushing harder, faster. The sound of footsteps crashed behind her. Then a blur. A rush of movement she barely saw before she was yanked sideways. A hand clamped over her mouth, pulling her into the shadows just as the men broke through the trees. Lucas. He pressed her against the rough bark of a tree, body solid, breath steady. His grip was firm but not bruising, his chest rising and falling too slow for the moment. His eyes burned into hers, a silent warning. Stay still. Maya swallowed hard, nodding once. The men stood just a few feet away, scanning the trees. She went this way, one of them said. Find her, another growled. If she knows we've got a problem? Maya felt Lucas's fingers tighten against her waist. She wasn't sure who they were talking about anymore, her or something else. The men moved forward, searching. Lucas didn't wait. He pulled her deeper into the woods, moving fast and silent, his grip sure. Maya followed, heart slamming against her ribs. She didn't know where they were going. She only knew she had no choice but to trust him. The woods closed in around them, thick with pine and shadow. Lucas led, fast and sure, cutting through the undergrowth without a sound. Maya followed, breath sharp, adrenaline pulsing hot through her limbs. Behind them the hunters were moving, boots crunching against damp leaves, voices low, searching. Lucas pulled her down into a dense thicket, branches wrapping around them like a cage. His hand landed firm on her arm, pressing her close. They crouched low, bodies tense, listening. The men were close. Too close. Maya held her breath. Anything, one of them said. A pause. Then another voice, lower. Not yet. She couldn't have gone far. Lucas's body was a line of heat against hers, steady and unmoving. He watched the tree line, muscles taut, breath measured. Like a predator waiting. Maya could feel his heartbeat. Or maybe it was hers. She didn't move, didn't blink. A long beat passed. Then another. Finally, one of the men spat. Leave it. We'll find her later. Their footsteps receded. The woods swallowed the sound. Maya let out a slow, shaky breath. Lucas stayed still a second longer, then shifted. His arm brushed hers, warmth bleeding through his shirt. You all right? His voice was low, rough. She nodded, still catching up to what had just happened. That was close. Lucas's jaw tightened. Too close. They sat there, neither speaking. The air between them felt tight, charged. Maya swallowed. Who the hell are those guys? Lucas exhaled through his nose. People who don't quit. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She turned toward him, eyes sharp. They knew what they were looking for. Lucas met her gaze. Yeah. The silence stretched. Maya looked down at her hands, mind racing. She replayed the voices, the way the men had spoken, the certainty in their movements. She thought about the old records, the name she'd found buried in the town's past. The same name they'd called each other, Lockwood. Her chest went tight. She looked up at Lucas, her throat dry. I think I know them. Lucas's expression didn't change, but his body did. It went still, too still. His eyes locked onto hers, sharp, knowing. Maya's breath hitched. Whatever was between them, whatever line they'd been walking, just shifted. And there was no going back. Act 2. The painful reveal. Maya sat at the motel's rickety desk, the journal spread open in front of her. The paper had yellowed, edges curled, ink faded to a rust brown. Her grandfather's handwriting was sharp and slanted, the kind of script that didn't waste time. She flipped through the pages, skimming past lists of dates and names until she found the section she didn't want to see. October 3rd, 1974. We tracked them to the eastern ridge. 5 dead before they knew we were there. The alpha went down harder, put up a fight. Should have seen the way the young one tried to get to him. Should have put him down, too. Maya's stomach twisted. She read it again, hoping she'd misread, but the words stayed the same. Her breath came sharp now, her hands gripping the paper like she could shake the truth out of it. She turned another page. More records, more kills. They know we're watching. They always know. But that doesn't mean they can stop us, she swallowed hard. The Lockwoods weren't just hunters. They weren't just a name buried in town records. They were hers. She slammed the journal shut. The motel room felt too small, the air too thick. Her pulse hammered as she shoved the book into her bag and grabbed her jacket. She needed air. No, she needed answers. And there was only one person who could give them to her. Lucas was at the edge of town when she found him, standing near his truck, arms crossed, watching the road like he knew something was coming. When he saw her, his eyes narrowed. She didn't stop. She walked straight to him, threw the journal down onto the truck bed. "Tell me," she said, voice tight. Lucas didn't move. His gaze dropped to the book, then back to her. His face was unreadable. "Tell you what?" "You know," she snapped. "You've always known." Lucas picked up the book, thumbed through the pages, stopped at a section that must be meant something. His jaw went tight. "You read this?" he asked. Maya let out a sharp breath. "Yeah, I read it." He nodded slow. Then he tossed the book back down like it was nothing. Maya felt heat rise in her chest. "Say something." Lucas's mouth set into a hard line. "What do you want me to say?" She took a step closer. "That it's not what it looks like." That my family wasn't hunting your pack like animals. That this, she gestured to the book, to him, to all of it, isn't what I think it is. Lucas's eyes locked onto hers, steady. Unforgiving. What do you think it is? Maya's throat went tight. She wanted to believe it wasn't true, that this was some mistake. But the words on the page were too clear. My grandfather, she started, but the sentence fell apart in her mouth. Lucas gave a slow exhale, stepping back like he was putting space between them. Now you understand. The words landed like a stone in her gut. Understand what? She asked, voice quieter now. Lucas's gaze was cold now, sharper than she'd ever seen it. That we were never just some town legend for you to chase. That you were never just looking. He let the words settle. You were always part of it. Maya felt her breath catch. No, she said, but it didn't sound like her own voice. Lucas's eyes stayed on her, steady as stone. I need to think, she muttered, stepping back. Lucas nodded once, not stopping her. Not saying anything else. Maya turned, walking away before the weight of it crushed her right where she stood. Maya sat on the edge of the motel bed, the journal open in her lap, her pulse hammering hard in her throat. The words on the page blurred. She'd read them 3 times already, but the meaning didn't change. They fight like animals because they are animals, but even animals can be hunted. She swallowed. Then the door burst open. Lucas. He was across the room before she could react, his movements fast, silent. His gaze dropped to the book, then locked onto her, sharp as a blade. She snapped the journal shut, but it was too late. He'd seen enough. His voice came low, cold. Where did you get that? Maya's grip tightened on the book. It's mine. Lucas reached out, grabbed it from her hands before she could stop him. His fingers skimmed the pages, landing on a passage. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. His shoulders went rigid, his breath slow and measured, like a man trying not to snap in half. Maya stood. Lucas, he held up the journal, eyes never leaving hers. This name, she didn't have to look. She knew what he meant. Lockwood. Maya forced herself to speak. It's my grandfather's. Lucas let out a slow breath. The kind that wasn't relief. The kind that came before something broke. She took a step toward him, but his eyes stopped her cold. They weren't just angry. They weren't just hurt. They were something deeper. You knew, he said, voice quiet. Maya shook her head fast. I didn't. Not until you knew, he repeated, and this time it wasn't quiet. You came into town asking questions you already had the answers to. No, she swallowed hard. Lucas, I swear. He slammed the journal onto the table. Don't. The word cut through the air like a knife. Maya's stomach twisted. I came here looking for a story. I didn't know it was this story. I didn't know. Lucas stepped back, shaking his head, like he needed space to breathe. You expect me to believe that? His jaw was tight, his hands curled into fists. You walk into this town, into my life, and now I'm just supposed to believe you didn't know what your family did. She felt the words before she heard them. Into my life. Maya exhaled slow. I know what this looks like. Lucas laughed, but there was no humor in it. No, you don't. He turned toward the door, grabbing the handle. Maya felt something crack in her chest. Lucas, wait, but he was already gone. The rain had started, a slow, steady patter against the motel window. Maya barely heard it over the pounding in her ears. Lucas was gone. The door still rattled from the way he'd left. She stood there, frozen, her grandfather's journal lying open on the table. The words carved into her brain, like an old wound reopened. Then the knock came. Not Lucas. He wouldn't have knocked. Maya crossed the room, her legs moving before her mind could catch up. She opened the door. The Alpha stood there. She'd only seen him once before at a distance. Now, up close, he filled the doorway, broad shoulders blocking out what little light the hallway had. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes weren't. She knew what was coming before he even spoke. You need to leave. Maya felt the words like a fist to the ribs. You should have been honest, he cut in. His voice was steady, unshaken. Now it's too late for that. She gripped the doorframe, pulse kicking up. I didn't come here to hurt anyone. The alpha's gaze didn't waver. That's not the point. Her mouth went dry. Then what is? The pack doesn't trust you. And neither does he. The air went still. Maya swallowed. Lucas the alpha's expression stayed firm. Lucas is a good man. But he's got too many ghosts to carry yours too. He exhaled, slow. Whatever this was between you two, it's done. Maya felt something crack inside her. The alpha stepped back. There's a bus leaving in the morning. Be on it. Then he walked away. Maya shut the door before the shake in her hands could catch up with her. The night stretched long, heavy with silence. Maya didn't sleep. She sat on the bed, the journal still open in front of her, the words blurring together. Her grandfather's legacy. Her name tied to it, blood soaking through the years. She should go. It was the smart thing, the safe thing. But her gut told her something different. And that's what scared her the most. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, but when the knock came again, she knew who it was. Lucas. She opened the door. He was standing in the rain, his shirt damp, his hands at his sides, his face unreadable. She opened her mouth, but he spoke first. I don't know if I can do this, he said. Maya's throat tightened. Lucas, I want to believe you, he said, voice low, raw. I do. But I can't. The words cut through her. Lucas exhaled, looked at her like he was memorizing something. Then he turned and walked away. The motel room smelled like stale air and cheap lemon cleaner. The mattress was lumpy. The bedside lamp flickered like it had given up trying to work properly, and the carpet carried old cigarette burns. It was a room for people who passed through without leaving a trace. Fitting. Maya sat on the edge of the bed, hands clenched in her lap, staring at the peeling wallpaper as if it held answers. But it didn't. Nothing did. Her grandfather's journal sat beside her, its presence an anchor, heavy with things she didn't want to carry. Lucas hadn't called, hadn't shown up, hadn't given her so much as a damn glance when she'd seen him across the street earlier that day, his shoulders stiff, his expression unreadable. She'd lost him, and she couldn't even blame him for walking away. Rumors had spread like wildfire. People in town barely looked at her now, and when they did, it wasn't friendly. The woman at the cafe who'd once served her coffee with a smile now placed it on the counter and turned her back before Maya could reach for it. The gas station attendant who used to make dry jokes about the weather suddenly had nothing to say. They knew. Or at least they knew enough to decide she wasn't welcome anymore. And the worst part, she understood why. Her family had brought blood and pain to this place, had hunted Lucas's people like sport, and she'd walked in, oblivious, asking questions that reopened wounds she hadn't even known existed. She dragged a hand down her face, her chest a riot of emotions, guilt, frustration, something raw and aching she didn't want to name. A sharp knock on the door made her heart stutter. For one ridiculous second, she hoped it was Lucas. She forced herself to her feet, crossing the room in a few quick strides, and pulled the door open. It wasn't him. The motel manager stood there, a wiry man with thinning hair and the perpetual scent of cheap cologne clinging to him. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Time to check out," he said, his tone flat. Maya frowned. "I paid through the week." His gaze flicked past her, like he wanted to make sure she wasn't hiding anyone inside. New policy. No long stays. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't about a policy. This was about the town closing ranks. She exhaled through her nose, gripping the edge of the door. "I don't have anywhere else to go." He didn't blink. "Not my problem." The finality in his voice made her chest tighten. She could fight, argue, but it wouldn't change a damn thing. People like him weren't interested in explanations. They were interested in keeping their town safe. And as far as they were concerned, she wasn't safe. She nodded once, then shut the door. Her pulse pounded as she turned, her hands shaking with the effort to hold it together. But the moment she caught sight of the journal on the bed, the weight of everything hit her all at once. She pressed the heels of her palms into her eyes, swallowing against the burn in her throat. She hadn't cried in years. Not when she'd left home. Not when she'd realized she didn't have anyone waiting for her anywhere. Not even when Lucas had walked away. But now, alone in a shitty motel with nowhere to go and nothing left to lose, she wasn't sure she could hold back any longer. Lucas Wolfe was losing his mind. The whiskey bottle sat untouched on the wooden table, condensation pooling around its base. He hadn't touched a drop, but the ghosts in his head still danced like he was drowning in it. He braced his arms against the edge of the kitchen counter, breathing deep, staring at the battered walls of his cabin like they held answers. They didn't. The pack was gathering tonight. He should be there. He should be standing shoulder to shoulder with them, listening to the alpha talk strategy, preparing for whatever move the hunters would make next. But he wasn't. He was here, alone, stewing in things he didn't want to face. Maya. Her name slid through his mind like a whisper over skin, something too soft, too dangerous. He cursed under his breath, dragging a hand through his hair. He hadn't been able to sleep since he walked away from her. The image of her standing there, eyes full of something raw, hands curled into fists like she was bracing for a hit, was burned into him. She'd looked at him like he'd gutted her, like she hadn't seen it coming. His fists clenched against the countertop. She should have. Her family had hunted them, killed them, put his father in the ground. But she hadn't known. That was the thing gnawing at him, the thing he hated. He'd seen the shock in her eyes, the way her whole body had gone rigid when she read those pages. She hadn't known, and yet she'd still carried the blame, still let it settle over her like she deserved it. And he'd let her. A growl rumbled in his chest, low and sharp, vibrating through him. He turned, shoving off the counter, needing something to do, something to break the cycle of thoughts that kept circling back to her. His boots scraped against the wooden floor as he paced. He shouldn't be thinking about the way she smelled warm, a little sweet, something just a touch wild, like she belonged under the open sky. He shouldn't be remembering the way her lips parted when she got caught up in an argument, or the way her fingers twitched when she held back from touching him. And he sure as hell shouldn't be recalling the way she'd felt in his arms when he'd caught her in that damn barn, like she belonged there, like she'd been molded for him. He exhaled hard, pacing to the other side of the cabin. His wolf was restless, agitated. It wanted to go to her. Lucas clenched his jaw. No, he'd made his choice. He'd walked away. But as he stood there in the dim light, heart hammering, the truth sat heavy in his chest. He might have walked away, but it sure as hell didn't feel like he'd let her go. Maya sat at the motel's wobbly desk, her fingers resting on the open journal, but she wasn't reading. The words blurred together, nothing more than ink and regret. Outside, the neon vacancy sign buzzed, casting red light through the room like an omen. She should pack. The town didn't want her here. Lucas didn't want her here. Her chest squeezed. No, that wasn't true. She could still feel his presence like an unfinished sentence, a promise cut short. She wanted to go to him, wanted to yell, demand, touch, but something heavy sat in her gut. It wasn't just guilt, it was the realization that Lucas might never look at her the same way again. She gritted her teeth. Screw this. Maya grabbed her jacket, yanked open the door, and froze. Lucas stood across the street, leaning against his truck, arms folded, looking every bit as brooding and untouchable as ever. His gaze was unreadable, but there was tension in the way he held himself, like a man torn between instinct and reason. Her fingers twitched at her side. Walk over. Say something. Lucas's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring, like he caught her scent, even from a distance. His muscles coiled, his weight shifting like he might move, might cross the damn road and do something, but then he didn't. And neither did she. The moment stretched, thin and breakable, neither of them willing to make the first move. Then Lucas exhaled sharply, like he was cutting something off inside himself, and turned. Maya's stomach knotted. "No, don't go." But he climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove off, disappearing down the road without looking back. A sharp breath rattled from her lips, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could have called out, could have run after him. But she didn't. Pride, fear, the endless what-ifs wrapped around her throat and squeezed. She swallowed hard, pressing a hand to her chest as the truth settled into her bones. They'd just let something slip away, and she had a feeling they'd regret it. Maya stayed outside for a long time, staring at the empty street, the night wind cool against her skin. The motel parking lot was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of insects. Too quiet. Something shifted in the air. She stiffened. A presence. Close, watching. The hairs on her arms rose before the voice slid out of the darkness. "You should leave town." Maya spun, her pulse slamming into overdrive. A man stood just past the motel's broken fence, half hidden in the shadows. Not Lucas. Tall, lean, wearing a dark jacket and a smirk that didn't reach his cold eyes. The kind of man who didn't need to carry a weapon to be dangerous because he was one. Maya's muscles coiled, ready. She kept her voice steady. "Is this the part where you tell me I don't belong here?" The man chuckled, the sound low and unpleasant. "No, sweetheart. This is the part where I tell you exactly what's going to happen if you don't listen." Maya clenched her jaw, refusing to step back. "And what's that?" The man tilted his head, slow, deliberate. "You're going to help us." Her stomach dropped. Help them. The hunters. The man's smirk widened like he could taste her unease. "You're a Lockwood." "That means you're either with us," his voice turned sharp, lethal, "or against us." Maya's pulse kicked up, her instinct screaming, "Danger! Get out!" She squared her shoulders instead. "Go to hell." The man didn't blink. "Oh, sweetheart. You first." Then, just as smoothly as he'd appeared, he turned and vanished into the night. Maya stood there, breath tight in her chest, the weight of his words pressing down like a loaded gun against her ribs. She didn't have to guess what he meant. They weren't just watching her. They were waiting. And if she didn't make a choice, soon they'd make it for her. The scent of tension hung thick in the air. Lucas stood in the Alpha's cabin, arms crossed, back rigid, jaw locked tight enough to crack. He should have been out running patrols, should have been anywhere but standing here, listening to words that made his wolf snarl inside him. The hunters weren't just watching anymore. "They've moved in," the beta said, voice sharp. "Not just one or two strays passing through. This is coordinated." The Alpha nodded, his face unreadable, but Lucas knew what that meant. The pack leader was weighing their options, considering the fallout, calculating the cost of what came next. Lucas already knew what that cost was. Blood. He exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay still, to not let the anger burning through his gut take over. "How many?" "Enough," the beta said grimly. "And they're looking for something." Lucas's stomach clenched. Not something. Someone. His wolf bristled. They wanted Maya. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He hadn't seen her since the motel parking lot, since he'd stood there like a damn coward, watching her through his windshield, but not going to her. And now the hunters had backed her into a corner, and he wasn't sure she'd know how to fight her way out of it. The Alpha's voice cut through his thoughts. "We handle this before it becomes a war." Lucas's head snapped up. "It's already a war." The Alpha studied him for a long moment. "Then let's make sure we win." The pack house was buzzing with movement, wolves moving in and out, voices sharp, movements clipped. Weapons were checked, patrol routes assigned, strategies laid out in low, firm tones. Lucas barely heard any of it. His mind was on one thing, one person, Maya. He'd told himself he wasn't going to her, that she wasn't his to protect anymore, that she had made her choice. But the problem was, so had he. And no matter how pissed, how betrayed, how torn he felt, he couldn't let her face this alone. He turned, heading for the door. The beta caught his arm. "Where the hell are you going?" Lucas jerked free. "To finish something. Because if the hunters thought they could take her, use her, force her to pick a side. They were about to learn exactly what kind of monster they'd just provoked. The rain had picked up, soaking into Maya's jacket as she stood outside the motel, pulse steady but sharp. The hunter's words still echoed in her head. "You're either with us or against us." There was no offer of neutrality, no chance to walk away untouched. They saw her as an asset, a tool, a key to getting closer to the pack. They were wrong. She had spent her life searching for truth, for stories that mattered. Now she was living inside one, and there was only one way to end it: by choosing a side. She tugged the hood over her head and moved, weaving through the empty streets, keeping to the alleys. The town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. She could feel the change in the air, the shift in the balance. The pack was in danger, and so was Lucas. She pushed forward, her legs burning as she made her way toward his cabin. She'd only been there once, but she remembered the path. Tucked deep into the forest, it stood like a lone sentinel, separate from the pack's main grounds. She didn't know why he preferred the solitude, why he chose distance over belonging, but she understood it. It was why she had walked alone for so long. The cabin came into view, dark and still. Her fingers were stiff from the cold as she reached into her pocket, pulling out a pen and a scrap of paper from her notebook. She scrawled the words fast, blunt, pressing the ink deep into the page. "Hunters are moving. Not just watching anymore. You need to be ready." She hesitated, then underlined the last 3 words. "They're coming." She folded the note, tucked it under the door, pressing it into the small gap. A weight lifted from her chest. He'd see it. He'd know she had made her choice. A crack of movement in the distance made her stiffen. Her breath slowed, pulse hammering against her ribs. Maya turned, pressing herself against the side of the cabin, heart pounding. Down the hill, near the tree line, figures moved in the dark. Not one, not two, too many. The hunters weren't just planning anymore, they were moving. Her stomach tightened as she watched them gather, their weapons glinting under the sliver of moonlight breaking through the clouds. This wasn't some scouting mission. It was an assault, and if she didn't act fast, she'd be too late to stop it. Maya's lungs burned as she sprinted through the forest, branches clawing at her jacket, roots reaching up to trip her. She pushed harder. There was no time to be careful, no time to second-guess. The pack needed to know. The din loomed ahead, half hidden in the thick trees. She barely got a glimpse before she was tackled, her body hitting the damp earth hard. A growl rumbled above her, heavy paws pinning her down. Her pulse pounded as golden eyes bore into hers, hot breath ghosting over her skin. "Get the hell off me," she snapped, thrashing against the weight pressing her into the ground. A second later the wolf shifted. Muscles and bones cracked as human flesh replaced fur, and suddenly she was staring up at a broad-shouldered man with a face full of suspicion. "You don't belong here," he ground out, his grip bruising as he yanked her upright. Maya jerked free, ignoring the sting in her ribs. "Yeah, tell that to the hunters gearing up to rip through this place." More wolves surrounded her now, their forms half hidden by the trees, their eyes glowing with distrust. "Let me speak to the alpha." Her voice didn't waver. "You're a Lockwood," one of them spat. "Why the hell should we listen to you?" Maya's heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't have time for this. She didn't have time to win them over. So she did the only thing she could. She raised her voice and hoped the right person heard her. "You can either listen to me or watch your pack die." A tense silence followed. Then came a low, familiar growl. The wolves parted as Lucas stepped forward, his expression carved from stone. Maya swallowed hard. His eyes weren't cold, they were worse. They were unreadable. Her stomach twisted. "He still doesn't trust me." But that didn't matter right now. Lucas tilted his head, arms crossed. "Talk fast." She took a breath. "They're coming. Not to watch, not to scout, to wipe this place out." She met the alpha's gaze. "You need to move now." A ripple of tension spread through the pack. The alpha studied her for a long, suffocating moment. "And I should take your word for this?" Maya's throat tightened. "I'm not them. I don't care about my name. I don't care about bloodlines. I care about stopping them. Because if I don't, her voice faltered. She forced it steady. If I don't, then I might as well be one of them. Lucas exhaled sharply. Something in his gaze shifted. Maya wasn't sure what it meant, wasn't sure what it changed, but he stepped between her and the wolves. She's telling the truth, he said, voice rough. She stays. The alpha's eyes narrowed. And if you're wrong? Lucas's gaze never wavered. Then it's on me. Silence stretched. Then the alpha turned to the pack. We prepare for war. A howl split the air. Maya barely had time to breathe before a gunshot cracked through the night. The attack had begun. The scent of rain, sweat, and blood clung to the air. Lucas stood at the center of the pack, his body thrumming with tension, his wolf clawing at the edges, ready to rip into flesh. The hunters were coming. The pack had the advantage. They knew the land, the forest was theirs. But the hunters had firepower, numbers, and a twisted sense of purpose that made them reckless. Maya stood just outside the ring of wolves, arms crossed, her jaw tight. Lucas could feel the weight of her stare, even if he wouldn't meet it. He wasn't sure he could. Give me something to do. Her voice cut through the dark, firm, unwavering. His head snapped toward her. You think I'm letting you near them? You don't get to let me do anything, she shot back, stepping closer. I can help. A growl rattled in his chest. You've done enough. Maya's eyes flashed with frustration. You want to win this or let your pride get in the way. A low chuckle came from the beater. She's got a point, Lucas. Lucas exhaled hard through his nose, every instinct screaming to keep her out of this. But she was stubborn, relentless, and there was no time to argue. He ground his teeth. What do you have in mind? Maya squared her shoulders. A distraction. Lucas swore under his breath. You want them to shoot at you. If it means pulling their attention off the den, then yes. The wolf in him snarled at the thought, at the idea of her out there alone, bait for the very people who wanted her dead. But she was right. He reached out, curled his fingers around her wrist, pulling her close. His grip was firm, his voice rough. You don't die. You hear me? Her throat bobbed. I hear you. He searched her face, hating that he couldn't stop this. Hating that it had come to this at all. Then he let her go. Gunfire ripped through the trees. Chaos erupted. Wolves shifted, launching into the night, bodies colliding with intruders, growls and snarls blending with the crack of bullets. Maya ran, her heart slamming against her ribs, her breath coming sharp. The hunters spotted her, just as planned, their attention snapping toward the lone woman weaving through the trees. One shouted something, she didn't catch it. She just kept running. A shot rang out, biting into the bark near her shoulder. She dropped, rolling, gasping at the sting in her arm. It was grazed, nothing deep, nothing to stop her, but it still burned like hell. Boots thundered behind her. She pushed up, sprinting again, leading them further from the den. Then a hand clamped around her arm, yanking her back. She twisted, eyes locking onto a man she recognized from the motel parking lot, the one who had threatened her. Brave girl, he rasped, holding her firm. Just like your grandfather. Rage bubbled up, red-hot and uncontrollable. I'm nothing like him. The hunter smirked. That's what they all say. Maya slammed her knee into his gut. He grunted, but his grip didn't loosen. She threw her elbow into his jaw, forcing him to stagger. His hand flew up. Reaching for his gun, she grabbed his wrist, twisting hard. The gun went off, the bullet going wide into the trees. She kicked his leg out from under him, sending him crashing onto his back. Before he could recover, she grabbed the gun and leveled it at his chest. His smirk didn't waver. You gonna pull the trigger? Her hand shook, not with fear, with fury. This man, his family, had spent generations hunting Lucas's kind, had carved up wolves, slaughtered them like sport, had driven that same cruelty into her bloodline, into the name she carried. She pressed the barrel harder against his ribs. A growl broke through the noise of the battle, deep and dark and pure rage. Lucas. His wolf burst through the trees, a monstrous black shape with wild, glowing eyes. The hunter's smirk finally fell. Lucas didn't hesitate. He lunged. Maya barely had time to step back before the weight of the wolf crashed into the hunter, knocking him flat. Teeth snapped. Bones crunched. Maya turned away, stomach lurching. When she looked back, Lucas was standing over the man's body, his chest heaving, his mouth stained red. His wolf's eyes locked onto hers, something wild and furious burning in them. For a second, she thought he was lost to it, to the bloodlust, to the violence. Then he shifted, muscles pulling, bones cracking, until Lucas stood before her, human again. His gaze swept over her, his nostrils flaring, taking in every inch of her like he needed to be sure she was whole. She exhaled shakily. "It's over," she rasped. Lucas shook his head. "Not yet." A gunshot rang out in the distance. Maya's stomach dropped. The fight wasn't over. Not even close. Smoke and blood hung thick in the air, mingling with the scent of wet earth. The battle was over, but the weight of it still pressed down on the pack, settling into their bones like an old ache. Maya moved through the makeshift infirmary, quiet clearing near the den, where injured wolves lay on cots, their wounds tended by steady hands. She wasn't a healer, but she knew how to clean a wound, how to wrap bandages, how to hold someone's hand when the pain got too much. She pressed a damp cloth to the beta's temple, wiping away dried blood. He hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. "You're lucky," she said. "Could have been worse," he grunted. "Could have been better, too." Maya huffed a tired laugh. "You'll live." He eyed her, something unreadable in his expression. "Yeah, thanks to you." Her stomach tightened. She wasn't used to this, to belonging, to being part of something instead of just observing it from the outside. Footsteps approached, heavy, measured. Maya looked up, heart hammering. The Alpha. He stopped beside her, his gaze sweeping over the wounded, then settling on her. "You fought for us," he said, voice low, rough. "Not just for him, for the pack." Maya swallowed hard. "I told you I'm not my family." The Alpha studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "No, you're not." It wasn't an embrace, wasn't a grand declaration of welcome, but it was something. And from a man like him, it was everything. Maya didn't realize how heavy her limbs felt until she finally sat down. The adrenaline had burned out, leaving her exhausted and aching. She rested her forehead against her knees, trying to steady herself, trying to process all of it. She wasn't sure how long she sat there before she felt him. Lucas. The air shifted, charged, thick with the bond between them. She lifted her head, watching as he walked toward her, his body loose but controlled, like a wolf approaching something fragile. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held things she wasn't sure he was ready to say. He stopped in front of her, exhaling slow. "You stayed." Her chest tightened. "You thought I'd leave." Lucas rubbed the back of his neck. "You had every reason to." Maya stood, closing the space between them. "So did you?" His jaw tensed. "I tried." Her stomach dipped. "Yeah." Lucas let out a rough breath. "Didn't work." She should have been smug about that, should have smiled. Instead, she reached for him, her fingers brushing over his forearm, feeling the tension there, the heat. Lucas inhaled sharply. His gaze dropped to where she touched him, then back to her face. He didn't pull away. "I don't want to lose you," he admitted, voice low, raw. "But I don't know how to." Maya stepped closer, pressing a hand flat against his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat. "Then don't," she said simply. Lucas let out a shuddering breath, like something inside him finally cracked open. His hand came up, cupping the side of her face, his thumb tracing the edge of her jaw. His touch was warm, solid, real. "I want this," he said, voice rough with emotion. "You." "Us." Maya exhaled, leaning into him. "Then take it." Lucas didn't hesitate. He kissed her. And this time neither of them walked away. The moon hung heavy in the sky, its silver glow washing over the clearing like it had been waiting for this moment. For them. Maya stood beneath its light, her pulse steady, her body thrumming with something deep, something primal. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't caught between two worlds, lost in the past. She was here, exactly where she was meant to be. And Lucas, he stood before her, broad and unshaken, his eyes locked on hers like they were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. Like he had finally stopped fighting fate. The pack surrounded them, silent but present, watching, waiting. There was no tension now, no suspicion, only acceptance. Lucas reached for her, his touch warm, grounding. His fingers slid along her jaw, tilting her chin up, his thumb tracing the corner of her mouth. His voice was raw, rough-edged. "You're mine." Maya's breath caught, but she didn't hesitate. "And you're mine." A slow, satisfied smile curved his lips. "Took you long enough to admit it." She huffed a quiet laugh, but her throat was tight, her heart full. "Had to make sure you deserved me." Lucas growled low, stepping closer, pressing his forehead to hers. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving it." The air between them buzzed with energy, not just attraction, not just desire. Something deeper. A bond forged in blood and fire, in war and choice. Maya slid her hands up his chest, resting them over his heartbeat. "I love you." Lucas exhaled hard, like those words had been a weight in his chest, waiting to be freed. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her in, holding her like he'd never let go. "I love you too." A howl rose from the pack, the sound rich with approval, with acceptance, with unity. One by one, more voices joined, filling the night with something ancient and powerful. Lucas didn't look away from her. "You hear that?" Maya nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "They're calling you home." She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt. She wasn't an outsider. She was his. She was theirs. And she was exactly where she belonged. The valley stretched wide before them, bathed in silver light. The world was quiet, peaceful. Lucas sat beside her on the edge of the overlook, his arm draped lazily around her shoulders. Maya leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, breathing him in. She had spent so long chasing stories, looking for something that mattered. But this was the story worth telling, not about the hunters, not about bloodlines or war or past sins. This was about them. About breaking cycles, about carving out something new, something no one could take from them. Lucas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You thinking about leaving?" Maya turned her face up to his, her lips curving. "Not a chance." Lucas hummed, his grip on her tightening. "Good." They sat there in silence, watching the moon rise, watching the future unfold before them. Together.